and some of the best financial videos and articles from the web. And as usual, it's totally free of charge. So what are you waiting for? Click here and sign up today. Hey everyone, this is Elijah Johnson with FinanceAndLiberty.com, and with us today is Clif High from HalfPastHuman.com. Clif, thank you so much for joining us today.
Glad to do it. It's a nice break in the day.
All right. Well, I'd first like to discuss what your Webbot is saying about gold and silver. Do you want to first tell us a little bit about the, calculations you do, and then also what they're telling you about gold and silver right now?
The calculations I do are based entirely on a system of assigning numerics for emotional qualifiers and then assigning those emotional qualifiers to words. So I'm basically summing up, if you will, emotional tones that are assigned by my system to various different memes out and about. Excuse me. And so the emotional tone has been predictive in the past and continues to be so when we get out of our own way and sort of let it happen, if that sort of makes sense.
Yeah, and for our viewers, what are these emotional tones?
Well, for instance, on individual words, you can have a spread of emotion. Well, it gets really complex. Okay, there's two basic kinds of emotions. There's building tension motion and release of tension emotion. And the difference between those is how your body actually physically reacts in its processing of that emotion. So some emotions are happy emotions or sad, but they're release emotions. So you could be jumping up and down for joy, or jumping up and down in horror, or weeping, and they're all release emotions. And the other side of it are building tension emotions, where your body sort of like contracts, if you will, your muscles get tight, and you build up stress hormones. And so we can actually qualify and quantify emotions based on this division. And then we bring in things like this guy's Plutchik's wheel of emotions that I've added another layer on to tie it into the body. And then we tie all those emotional parameters to various words, because those words are either expressions of our reaction to an emotion, or they sometimes can cause us to react emotionally. So if someone's screaming at you, yes, you are reacting to the screaming part, but there is still an emotional attachment to the individual words that are being used. Frequently it doesn't matter what they're saying. The abuse is in the tone and so on. And what my system does is we've assigned these values to all these different words. When the words show up relative to our prescient keywords, then we make we make sums in the categories of things like a duration of emotion, propagation of emotion outward from the original point of contact in our system, intensity of emotion based on its type, release or building tension, aggregation of emotion, whether it's a propagation emotion. In other words, if I come on up and I'm really in an angry mood and I'm the original emotive force, and I come and I slap you across the face, you will have an emotive reaction from that. And so that's sort of the propagation of the emotion, but it doesn't necessarily have to respond with anger. If I'm angry, it doesn't necessarily mean that a propagation is going to respond with anger. And so there's all these nuances that go on, and all these are summed up by my computer algorithms and delivered with some level of confidence. Let me put it that way. We've been pretty spectacularly right in the past, and we're frequently wrong. But the frequently wrong part is so small, it still puts us way above chance. Sort of makes sense?
Yes, and how does this then relate to gold and silver, and what does your Webbot then say for the current state of the gold and silver markets?
Okay, so very good. How do you tie it to such thing as a material reality? Okay, we have to first acknowledge that the material reality of gold has an emotional range in it. Okay, so some persons can hold gold and they get an actual physical body response to it, and it makes them happy just holding it. It changes their emotional tones. They've really hooked for it, right? And all the way at the other end are those people that are, rather clinically considering it to be an asset, but they will still have positive or negative emotions around it based on their idea of wealth and so on. So again, we're dealing with human emotion and abstraction. So for all my system has to do is to find the word gold and then sweep around it in the internet and pick up all the words around it, and then it goes through a very complex linguistic analysis processing and tells me the contexts of the emotional values. I don't really care much about the words it brings up. I'm interested in the emotional values for these many different array vectors, such as I pointed out, intensity, duration, propagation, etc. And I have a multidimensional array that's 8 by 8 and 10 deep, so we can really encode a lot of information about emotional parameters around a word as well as the context from which it comes.
So what is your Webbot then saying about the gold and silver markets right now?
Emotionally, for probably the last 3 years, we've been on a very steady upward pressure with intermittent lapses of attention, or I guess you'd have to say a failure to put any emotional impetus into the markets. And then that changed in early 2016 or so. And the emotional tone on gold and silver became very much more aggressive. And so the intensity levels rose, as well as the duration of the emotional impact, but we had yet to see the propagation values go out. By propagation values, this is where these emotions propagate out into areas that are not within their normal niche. So would be usual for me to see a discussion of gold on a gold site, but to see a discussion of gold panning, any of these kind of words, gold, any excitement words about gold, and to find that in a gardening forum or a bread baking forum or a quilting forum is unusual, exceptional, and should be meaningful within my system. And we've seen a lot more of that language in the last 4 or 5 months, to the point where our latest report is saying that we're just about to break out into a gold rush kind of a mentality within the United States, let's say over the next 3 or 4 months. It comes out in the shorter term data, which has a range of about 3 or 4 months. So a lot more people are going to be excited about gold. And already are. We've seen an uptick of probably 7 or 8% in manifesting language that we use to reconcile against the actual or against the forecast. So we're already seeing that uptick in manifesting linguistics around gold that are going to lead to the idea of a gold rush. Now, this is coincident with very I guess we'd have to say pressured language around silver. And so we're getting pressured language around silver at emotional levels from various different viewpoints. So we have a lot of oppressive language, a lot of suppressive language, not very much in the way of positive excitement language, a lot of anxiety language all around silver. And the curious part around this, though, is the context in which we're getting a lot of the anxiety language is not on the part of the people that you might think of as silver investors or silver stackers, but rather is on the coming through from contexts that clearly can be identified as being industrial or governmental. So they're worried.
Now, I know back in 2010 and 11, we saw a big bull run for silver and also gold. Is your Webbot kind of showing the same signals that it saw back then?
Actually, it's seeing the same. We're seeing the same kind of things that were manifesting in 2007. Within our data sets in terms of the emotional attachments and the way in which it's being hammered, pushed down, still grows, hammered, pushed down, still grows. It's a particular, it's not like a chart pattern, but it is numerically able to be tracked. And so we're in a period of time that resembles 2007 or 8 much more than it does 2011 or 12. And I would suggest that we still have the emotional duration values from that bull run, and it never completed. It was like curtailed and chopped off. And so the emotional energies involved have been suppressed and held in place, if you will, not fulfilled. And it's really just a curious way of thinking about it, but I think a lot of the chartists would agree that once there's a certain amount of energy locked up into a particular direction in these sorts of things, it seems that it must pretty much try and work itself out. Thus, I think we're headed up again.
Definitely. And I guess if you wanted to share with our viewers then, just basically kind of, I don't know, maybe in plain English, where you see the gold and silver markets heading in the near future then.
Okay, sure. No worries. I've got you. It's very difficult to understand the reports we've got here because the predictive linguistics, the report is really a bunch of words about words. So we can just sort of eliminate that and say that, and go right to sort of a projection and say that right at the moment we're in this period of time that the reports had identified, that the data had identified, that would extend from the middle of March through to the very end of May. And it actually sort of fades off a little bit into early June. So it's not a clear, precise ending. These time periods are delineated by the growth of the language that occurs during them as we move our model forward. And so the projection, the forecast is that we would run into chaos and confusion language that would start spreading rapidly from March 15 onward. And I think anyone who really does pay attention would agree with me. We've had chaos and confusion language. And then there were these other temporal markers that we were looking for, which included sort of a layoff burst or boom, if you will, in layoffs. Sort of a crashing economy, a lot of people losing their jobs. And if you look at the YouTube and the language coming out of it with the current crises and funding, it's exactly what we were forecasting. So everybody on YouTube basically has been laid off. And so this was our big burst there. So the temporal markers that we're looking for are in fact laying out at this moment. And they've been presciently defined in our previous reports here. And the projection for this is that from this point forward, we're going to continue, and sometime in this period of what I defined of as an intense grinding of chaos, if you will, was from March until the end of May. Sometime in that period of time, the silver market was going to be slipping out of control of the market manipulators. Not permanently, not very long, and it won't rise very high, but our data sets had defined this slippage as being related to a technical error that they kind of make and a hole in their algorithms, if you will, something they'd overlooked in their design that occurs in the real world. Their algos aren't prepared for it and basically take a backseat or run offline or do something, but don't behave appropriately, and silver gaps up. And then they'll be able to get it back under control sometime after this period of time. So sometime in the hiatus of emotions that we had for June and July, they'll get their silver market back under control. But the way in which it's defined in our data sets, that control is through slippery hands. And so they're always fighting a retreating action, trying to keep the silver market down. And then there's all kinds of technical supporting issues we could go into at details, but that's the projection for these next few months. And we've had enough temporal markers so far that I'm reasonably confident that indeed we are on that particular track at this point, and that indeed the chaos actually, when we start looking at the language, running what I call reconciliation programs, which go and look for the language we forecast, basically. When we started running those, we saw that the chaos really had begun around the 7th of March, and coincidentally, that was about the time that the YouTube advertiser boycott began. And so from that point on, the temporal markers are falling into place. As of this point, I see no reason to change the forecast that suggests that our first episode of slippage of control in the silver market will occur sometime between now and the end of May. And I have a reason to suspect, because of the way the data rushes in and bulges in, that it will be coincident with a big upward push in Bitcoin, and that both of those should occur sometime, say, of the weekend that separates the third week in May from the last week in May.
Very interesting. And I know your Webbot also studies the debt ceiling. So what is it saying specifically regarding the topic of the debt ceiling right now?
Well, that's a really curious one because if you drill into these things, okay, these linguistic structures are based on a fuzzy set understanding. So you can think of one of these things as basically like those dolls that nest in each other. And so as you get further and further into the details, in our case, the dolls actually get bigger. There's a lot more details, but they become less meaningful unless you drill down, so to speak, from the smaller elements into the larger masses. When we do this around the debt ceiling, we find that there's a something that is difficult for us to describe that is going to probably be overtaking the economic situation of the government this fall, and that our first hints of it occurring are within the data anyway, are showing up as we move the model space into the second and third week of August. Now, I can put words around it, but they're going to be hugely misleading because we have a lot of words that are specifically referencing unknown. So that usually is the data is sort of if we want to think about it this way, presenting a picture that we don't have words to define. So in this case, maybe it's describing some kind of a basic government, like a centipede, like it all separates out into the various little elements rather than a shutdown. But these are all of these projections, when we follow them all the way back up, they're now tied with the forecast around that originate from the data that comes in around the debt ceiling, and the way that the data describes it is not really a debt ceiling, but that the debt supply is throttled, okay, as though debt was a commodity and had to be moved, and if you throttled the supply, those things and there's a lot of words like this that include things like veins and arteries and so on. And another point of our work is whenever we get into language like this where we're referencing human body parts or processes, that usually is very powerful prescient language because it comes down to an extremely low-level primal archetype. And so, that's why we describe some things as being visceral. It's because they hit you in the gut. Your gut actually physically reacts to certain words. And so those words are described as being visceral. And so we have all of these things already inbuilt into our language to tell us that this is indeed the case, that we react to these kind of things at that level. And so in our case now, we're getting that kind of language about a lot of stuff that is basically unknown in terms of what it will be or how we'll end up describing it, but we know it'll have certain levels of impact. So that being said, I would say we're not heading in towards, a stock market crash or anything like that, because that won't be particularly meaningful. That what the data is basically saying is some kind of something happens to how we deal with the concept of government, and that we're going to get into that in, as I say, the second or third week in August at some level. It doesn't really bulge out until about early October.
One of the other topics I'd like to discuss today is Russia and China and how they could be maybe attacking the dollar right now with gold. What is your Webbot saying about that right now?
Because we have our data sets or because we have the processing 100% neutral, and because this is a linguistic project, I would not use words like attacking because our data sets would see it the other way. They're defending themselves from what's being done to the dollar. So they're not attacking the dollar. This is not an economic warfare at that level. This is economic self-preservation on their part, and then a lot of that language comes through. So from the viewpoint of the data, the Chinese government is always running, the Chinese central authorities is really how our data sets describe it, because it's awful difficult in the Chinese infrastructure to separate where political power and economic power and military power are really separated. And given that, we've got this aggregate of the Chinese central authorities. And the deal there is that they've got huge issues, and they're very running around very paranoid. I wouldn't say scared, because they're proactive and they're doing taking actions to prevent things. But I also would not use the word, a prejudicial word of attacking. It does show all kinds of actions on the part of these two countries trying to preserve themselves against what they see as a behemoth frothing at the mouth with some kind of, dire internal disease and a brain structure that is absolutely rotted out with syphilis. And so you can't, from their perspective, they can't make any plans at all that relate to the USA with any surety at all, other than to be very defensive with everything, simply because there's no way of predicting exactly how the syphilitic beast is going to flail around next.
Well, Clif High, thank you so much for joining us today. Before we let you go, are there any last thoughts you had? And did you want to share with the viewers where they can find you online?
You can go and get the reports at halfpasthuman.com. You can follow me on Twitter at Clif_High. But they censor the tweets there, so it's been rather problematic. And I have a YouTube channel, Clif High on YouTube, so you can check it out there.
All right. Once again, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
This video was brought to you in part by ReluctantPreppers.com. And some of the best financial videos and articles from the web. And as usual, it's totally free of charge. So what are you waiting for? Click here and sign up today. Hey everyone, this is Elijah Johnson with FinanceAndLiberty.com, and with us today is Clif High from HalfPastHuman.com. Clif, thank you so much for joining us today.
Glad to do it. And we tie all those emotional parameters to various words, because those words are either expressions of our reaction to an emotion, or they sometimes can cause us to react emotionally. So if someone's screaming at you, yes, you are reacting to the screaming part, but there is still an emotional attachment to the individual words that are being used. Frequently it doesn't matter what they're saying. The abuse is in the tone and so on. And what my system does is we've assigned these values to all these different words. When the words show up, it's a nice break in the day.
All right. Well, I'd first like to discuss what your Webbot is saying about gold and silver. Did you want to first tell us a little bit about the calculations you do, and then also what they're telling you about gold and silver right now?
The calculations I do are based entirely on a system of assigning numerics for emotional qualifiers, and then assigning those emotional qualifiers to words. So I'm basically summing up, if you will, emotional tones that are assigned by my system to various different memes out and about. Excuse me. And so the emotional tone has been predictive in the past and continues to be so when we get out of our own way and sort of let it happen, if that sort of makes sense.
Yeah, and for our viewers, what are these emotional tones?
Well, for instance, on individual words, you can have a spread of emotion. Well, it gets really complex. Okay, there's two basic kinds of emotions. There's building tension motion and release of tension emotion. And the difference between those is how your body actually physically reacts in its processing of that emotion. So some emotions are happy emotions or sad, but they're release emotions. So you could be jumping up and down for joy, or jumping up and down in horror, or weeping, and they're all release emotions. And the other side of it are building tension emotions, where your body sort of like contracts, if you will. Your muscles get tight and you build up stress hormones. And so we can actually qualify and quantify emotions based on this division. And then we bring in things like this guy's Plutchik's wheel of emotions that I've added another layer on to tie it into the body. And